Ties between South Korea and Japan have gone sour to the worst level in decades due to unresolved historical disputes that have escalated to trade frictions. President Moon Jae-in took the lead in countering Tokyo's unexpected export curbs against Seoul, but we are yet to see a clear solution to the matter. Today, we go in depth on the historical issue that lies at the heart of Japan's export restrictions against South Korea, the compensation to victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. To give us a legal analysis of the issue, Dr. Se-ryeon, law professor at Kyung Hee University, joins me tonight in the studio. Thank you so much for coming in.
Happy to be here.
Seoul-Tokyo relations appear to be deteriorating by the day. How are you observing the two countries' relations recently?
Well, this is very disappointing. Our disputes with Japan on the diplomatic side, because of the history of Japanese annexation a long time ago, is pretty deep-rooted and frequent. But we never had a situation where we are confounding with the other aspect of our relationship, which is economic. We had the similar models, we had cooperations, and we formed a supply chain which is pretty robust, including in China, and has become a pretty big source of growth for the world. So disrupting this order is pretty unprecedented, and it's disappointing that it's going to hurt, of course, Korea, but Japan as well and the world, because this disruption of economic ties and supply chain will affect the world.
Now, putting our focus on the compensation of wartime forced labor, South Korea's Supreme Court ruled last year that Japanese firms must compensate the Korean victims of wartime forced labor. Could you explain to us in detail about the ruling that came in October last year?
Right. The cause of action arises from the historical the fact of the Japanese annexation. During the colonial times, there were many people who were mobilized against their wills, so it's a forced labor by the Japanese corporations under the authority of the colonial government. So their grievance is that they were not paid, there were some economic issues to be compensated, and that has survived to this day. And I kind of stress that it's an individual claim, not the government-to-government claim. And the Supreme Court said that the individual claims are still valid against the illegal act of Japanese corporations.
Japan obviously is against South Korean Supreme Court's ruling, asserting that it violates international laws. Is their argument correct?
Right. The basis of the argument on the international law is that actually there is a treaty between Korea and Japan in 1965, a basic treaty on relations between the two countries. And the treaty was necessary to nullify many coerced treaties between the Japan and Korea during the colonial times. But part of that is an economic package that the Japanese provided, about 800 million package, which has loan and grant amount. And there is some language that this will settle these two countries' claims. So Japan has been Japan has not been claiming that is a source of their claims, but they changed their position around 2000 and trying to say that kind of took care of all the claims, including the individual claims.
And that is the grounds of their argument that it
Right.
violates the international law. Now, the sticking point is whether the 1965 Seoul-Tokyo Agreement bars individual right of claim. Japanese Prime Minister Abe argues that the two sides, the two countries, agreed to give up individual right of claim when signing the 1965 Seoul-Tokyo Accord. But even some people in Japan and even some of Japan's legal professionals had made in the past clear that the accord does not dissolve the individual right of claim. Your thoughts on that?
Right. This is a little bit controversial, but not too much. Controversial in the sense that the language has in the treaty that this settles all the claims, and it does say that the claims of the people as well. But a couple of things. The matter of interpretation, but the international law, law scholars would say that the government-to-government claim does not dissolve or take care of the individual claims as well. And also, this is kind of ironic because Japan had the same opinion until about 2000. Interesting fact is that when 1965 treaty was signed, Japan had actually a cause of action against Korea in terms of individual claims because of what happened about a decade earlier. The Korean government at the time declared some peace line in the Eastern Sea, and the Japanese ships that crossed over, those fishermen, we kind of got the ships in one place and then incarcerated some people. So Japanese government has maintained that the individual claims of those people against the Korean government survives after 1965 treaty. So that has been their the position all along. And if you look at other claims that they had against Russia, they maintained the similar claims. But in about 2000, I don't know why they abruptly changed their position, but it has been consistently invoking international law based on the 1965 treaty.
Now, looking into the matter from a more fundamental perspective, is it legally possible to dissolve individuals' right to file lawsuits? Wouldn't it go against constitutional rights?
Right. It would be a very archaic position to say that the country can unilaterally dissolve the individual claims of their people. It goes clearly against the human rights principles these days. So there won't be much dissension among the constitutional scholars and any legal professional to say that the individual claims kind of be subsumed in the international treaty.
A very tough situation we are facing. Now, Japan had requested to form a panel of third country arbitrators to look into the wartime forced labor compensation issue. And Tokyo is also threatening with further retaliatory measure, further trade restrictions if South Korea does not respond to this by July 17th, which is just a few days away. But South Korea has no intention of forming a panel of third country arbitrators. Then what would happen after July 17th, the deadline?
Right. First of all, the Korean government is not per se ignoring their request. If the Japanese claim to have the arbitration is based on the international law claim, Korean government is consistent that it is not the subject of arbitration. Korean government cannot interfere with individual claims, and if the Japanese government is demanding the Korean government do something about its judiciary, that clearly goes against a separation of powers principle. So in that sense, Korean government is, I think, justified in saying that Korean government is limited in what we can do, and that's not the proper subject of arbitration. In terms of what would happen, probably if the speculation that Shinzo Abe's action, the Japanese government action, is somewhat geared towards taking an advantageous position in the upcoming elections, upper house elections. Probably that happens in later date than the July 17th, though nothing much will happen. But also, because of the historical stance that the Japan had, their actions kind of goes beyond the kind of the short-term gain in the election. I think the saber rattling will continue because that has been their position, and they have never really taken a position that the colonial illegal action was in fact their fault.
So you think the South Korean government will pass by the deadline, although not intentionally ignoring the deadline, but because it sees no necessity to form a third country arbitrator
Right, both
panel.
countries will take the consistent positions beyond that day.
Okay, the South Korean government has officially raised Japan's export curbs as an emergency agenda to the WTO's Council for Trade in Goods a few days ago. And the government also plans to file an official complaint to the WTO. How do you expect things to play out at the WTO? Do you think South Korean government can gain an upper hand?
Well, I think the Korean government will gain an upper hand, but not in a way that the people might think. WTO is not the world court. In a multilateral stage in a global governance, there is a limited function that these international institutions can do. Although WTO is more powerful than others, it takes a very long time to resolve this issue, and also probably that's why the Japan brought in this national security issue. It's hard to say for the government to demand another sovereign country to say that your raising of the national security issue is false or that's not acceptable. So in that sense, there are many instances where even though people's opinion might be that the government action is wrong, there is simply not much they can do.
So you don't expect anything dramatic from the WTO?
But the reason why I said the Korean government will have an upper hand is because this is also in addition to kind of dispute resolution body or kind of a function of a court, but it's a court of public opinions of the interested countries. Now, this curb will affect Korea, but then also Japan, but because we form a supply chain, it's going to hurt China and also United States, and by extension, it's going to hurt the global economy. So I think that the world opinion will actually has turned already against what Japan is doing, even if there's a chance that the Japan can win in a technical sense, kind of asserting national security, and those whitelist is a preferential treatment rather than a absolute ban. But I think that Japanese media is also worrying about this. The public opinion will turn against Japan as the discussion prolongs.
Well, that's at least one relief on the horizon. Now, what do you think is the necessary strategy for South Korea to quickly resolve this trade friction? Do you think South Korea needs to make some kind of a concession on the issue of compensation of wartime forced labor?
Well, that's what President Moon has suggested, to set up a fund between two countries so that we can pay for that without saying that the government is directly responsible. So it's a cooperative move, but Japan has rejected that move. I think we have to go back to the fundamental characteristic of this issue. It's a diplomatic issue that has a very long route and not an economic one. So we have to, at some point, to separate those two. Probably it might require some interventions from interested parties around the world, but probably it would be more prudent to have those two countries get together and say that, well, let's separate out what is not really at the issue, which is the economic well-being of these two countries, and deal with the diplomatic and historical issues as we have been.
Now, one last quick question for you before I let you go. It's no secret that Abe has the upper house election in mind.
Right.
Then when the election is over, do you think things will perhaps make a turnaround?
I think that definitely this action has this election in mind, but it's not a short-term gap. This position of Japan taking a serious stance against these historical issues is long-rooted and the old issue. So I think it's going to continue. I think that some sinister speculation is that because of the Japan not getting a kind of limelight after G20 because of the Panmunjom meeting, I think they're very resentful of the sudden shift of the limelight from them. And also, there is a kind of a motivation to kind of disrupt the relationship between Korea and the United States and also North Korea. So, as people say, there has been a concern about the Japan passing. So, there is a kind of effect of kind of percolating up some limelight and newsworthiness to Japan. So, in that sense, Japan is probably thinking about pursuing this route a little bit further.
Well, thank you, Dr. Song, as always, for your perspectives.
Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of News in Depth. From all of us here at Arirang, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you right back here, same time tomorrow.